Hello, good citizens. My name is Dan. In 2010, I started making videos and publishing them on YouTube. Since then, I've started several YouTube channels on various topics from wildlife, scammer calls, fishing, and many others, including my most important project, Not So Silent. And in early 2016, I started posting videos of my interactions with local law enforcement. This led to posting videos about our accountability issues with our police and justice system. Around that time, I started seeing videos on YouTube called First Amendment Audits, and I quickly became a fan of these types of videos, even though it was never something I wanted to do. I just liked watching them. Some of my first favorite channels were Max Tech Media, First Amendment Tests, Brett Sanders, Honor Your Oath, News Now San Diego, Tom Zebra, and The Batosai. Fast forward to today, there are almost countless YouTube channels now of First Amendment auditors in the United States, or as one of my more recent favorite channels likes to say, people are doing it from sea to shining sea. And it's odd because right now, really no one is doing this in Canada. And I can only think of a handful of people in BC and maybe Ontario that have attempted something similar to a First Amendment audit. Now, we've seen many examples of Canadians being assaulted, arrested, or harassed for public photography, and I still wonder why no one in Canada has seriously done a First Amendment audit-style Canadian audit with all the proper actual Canadian lingo, terminology, and not just someone who repeats what they hear on YouTube from the United States. I always assumed it would catch on here in Canada pretty quick, but it hasn't, and since it hasn't yet, I wanted to put out this not as legal advice, but as information you need to consider before doing this in Canada, as I believe it's going to come here to Canada soon. And what I don't want to see is someone starting to do this who may not be putting out a good example of how to do this in Canada and that catching on. Like, for example, if someone just flat out copied High Desert Community Watch and you did that in Canada, you could be arrested pretty quickly, in my opinion. So I thought now would be a good time to put this information out there before people start doing this in Canada. Now, before I decided to do this, I contemplated how I could make videos that expose the anti-police false narrative that police have created about me being a violent and very anti-police person. And I thought this would be one of the ways I could go about it. As you've seen in all my videos, I interact with police in a cool and calm manner. Clearly, I am not a violent or very anti-police person. Usually, if the police don't like you for whatever reason, and they have nothing on you to use against you because you're a law-abiding citizen, they create their own story that fits their narrative. One of the reasons they do this is to justify any future actions or interactions with you. If you're flagged for violence and noted to be very anti-police, even if you're not that type of person, it goes a long way in court if something happens in the future. Imagine this. The cops beat you up because they can, and you end up getting charged, and cops are testifying in court. One of the things they rely on is their prior knowledge of you being flagged for violence and being a very anti-police person. And that's what they use against me. There's all kinds of bulletins about my lawful behavior, like following proper court procedures, which has caused mass alarm against some of British Columbia's most brave and powerful government employees. Another reason why I wanted to do this, after a local prosecutor intentionally misled a judge in a sentencing hearing for an offense that I was forced to plead guilty to, and that I could not have committed according to the court's own record, ad hoc Crown Counsel Paul Jeffrey Cheeseman fabricated a statement that I was, quote, often outside the Victoria Police Department just filming officers coming and going from the building, unquote. Paul Jeffrey Cheeseman did fabricate this all on his own because not only have I never done that, there are no police officers that could tell him I've done that, and there are no statements from the Victoria Police about me doing that. So since this false information was brought before the courts and our local prosecutors cannot be held accountable because the laws don't apply to them, 7-part series on YouTube, I figured, you know what? That's exactly what I'm going to do, given the totality of the circumstances. And not only am I going to do it, but I'm going to share with you information on how you can do it in a safe, lawful, and reasonable manner. Make no mistake here, folks. This information is not intended to show you how to do a First Amendment audit. It's not going to show you how to bark orders at police or look good for the camera. And if that's what you hope to get out of this, you're going to be disappointed. Now, before I wrote this, I really had to unlearn what I had learned by watching First Amendment audits and make this Canadian version from the ground up, get all the Canadian lingo correct, and distance ourselves from the First Amendment audit with our own Canadian terminology and lingo that is exclusive to the Canadian version, relying on Canadian material, not First Amendment audit material. And that's what you're going to learn here, is how and where a First Amendment audit and the Canadian version are different. Again, this is my personal knowledge, experience, and opinions. I'm just communicating information. You don't have to listen to anything I say. If you have a different opinion, by all means, do it your way. So let's start with a brief history of photography. Photography and film date back all the way till the 1800s, and it wasn't until the late 80s and early 90s that photography and film started to become digitalized. In the 2010s, smartphones began making their way into the hands of thousands of people around the world. And with those smartphones came built-in digital cameras. Fast forward to today, in 2018, almost everyone has a smartphone, which also means that almost everyone has a digital camera on their person. Cameras, when used properly, can provide an objective record of events that otherwise might be difficult to prove without a digital record. And this is where we are today, where our police fear cameras. They don't want you recording them because they're used to doing things a certain way, their way. And if you're recording them, they cannot do things their way, the way they're used to doing things. So in the USA, citizens have a First Amendment right to photograph and record video in public. So in Canada, we don't have a First Amendment right to photograph and record video in public. So what do we have? In Canada, we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now, I hear some people quote Section 2 of the Charter for photography and recording in public, and that's fine. But what you might be missing is Section 1 of the Charter. If you know Section 2 but don't know Section 1, then you may want to have a look here, because it says Section 1. Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So right there, to me, it says that the Canadian government can place reasonable limits on your rights and freedoms, especially to preserve other rights. So long story short, what this says to me is that we won't know if the limits placed on your rights and freedoms is reasonable until you've gone through some sort of court process, whether it be criminal or civil or even both. So ask yourself, do you want to go through a court process to find out whether or not your rights and freedoms were reasonably limited? Because that's basically what you're in for if you choose to do this. Whatever you say you have the right or freedom to do, you may be the one who has to demonstrably justify it in court that the limits placed on your rights and freedoms were unreasonable in a free and democratic society. This can take years to do. If you can't do it yourself, you'll have to hire a lawyer to do it for you. If you can't do either, then you're not going to be able to fight back. And if that happens, you're basically allowing it to happen if you choose to do nothing. And if that is your only option, then you should not be doing this. I'll get into that more at the end of this video, but for now, make sure you read and understand Section 1 of the Charter. Just remember, reasonable is whatever they want it to be, not what you say it is. And if it comes down to it, it'll go before the courts. Canadian case law will be your most important tool. You can research and read up on Canadian case law on a website called the Canadian Legal Information Institute, or CanLII for short. Here you can search case law for offences such as mischief, public mischief, causing a disturbance. Those offences are similar to the American law called disorderly conduct. Obstructing police is another good one. And of course, know your provincial trespassing laws in and out. Section 2. Everyone has the following fundamental freedoms. Subsection B. Freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication. So, as I mentioned earlier, Section 2 of the Charter is what people commonly refer to for public photography or freedom of expression. And as you can see here, Section 2 of the Charter is called, quote, fundamental freedoms, unquote. So keep that in mind, because you might be inclined to say you have the right or rights to do this. That would be somewhat inaccurate, as Section 2 covers our fundamental freedoms. So it would be more accurate to say I have a fundamental freedom to do this, not I have the right to do this. Section 2, subsection B, freedom of expression and freedom of the press and other media of communication. Now, we've all heard First Amendment auditors say things like, I'm an investigative journalist gathering content for a story, and freedom of the press. So one of the things you need to be careful about doing this in Canada is never lie about who you are or what you're doing. And if you say you're a journalist, you could be lying. And in Canada, you don't need to make such a declaration that you're a journalist. And if you do, that may work against you. Unless you can back that up with more than just a camera, a YouTube channel, and a Facebook page. If you ever get arrested and prosecuted and try that story before a judge, I don't think a judge will buy it, especially if you have heated interactions with law enforcement. Not mentioning any names, but I've seen a few videos where people claim to be a journalist and then do things on video that, the judge is going to side with a reasonable person, not an unreasonable one. And I think it's pretty simple that you can just simplify it without going for the I'm a journalist routine. And I think this is much safer if you ever end up in court and have to defend your actions. Okay, so I would never say I'm a journalist, but if you were a journalist, you could rely on the Charter, Section 2, subsection B, freedom of the press. See, because here's the thing. Everybody with a camera, a YouTube channel, Twitter account, Facebook page, guess what? The Charter covers that too. As it states, quote, other media of communication, unquote. Right. Because a YouTube channel is exactly that, other media of communication. So you don't have to declare you're a journalist or freedom of the press. You don't have to. Because other media of communication and your YouTube channel is all you need to say or rely on. And that has the same protection as a journalist / freedom of the press. So I would never say I'm a journalist or say freedom of the press. I would say I'm gathering information of public interest to communicate through my YouTube channel or something similar. That way no one can twist what I said to make it look like I was lying about who I was or what I was doing. I think I said it best in one of my videos when I approached a prosecutor on the sidewalk and said something like, hi, my name is Dan. I have a YouTube channel called Not So Silent, and what the Charter refers to as other media of communication. And then I asked him my question. Didn't say I was a journalist. Didn't say I'm freedom of the press. I don't need to rely on that. I'm relying on other media of communication, which is just me and my YouTube channel. And that's got as much protection as a journalist and freedom of the press. Here is some information about when you have to ID in Canada. So in Canada, you only have to ID yourself if you've been lawfully arrested or caught committing or about to commit a criminal offence of some sort. This would include offences under the Motor Vehicle Acts, while operating a motor vehicle, riding a bike, jaywalking, or something similar, as well as any bylaw offences or trespassing. So if you're a pedestrian and you jaywalk or commit a similar offence, or you're on your bike or in a motor vehicle and they claim you committed some sort of an offence, you must provide identification. If you don't, you could be charged with obstructing police, much like in Moore versus the Queen, 1978, which I'll get into later. And you also cannot give a false name. That would also be obstructing police. A lot of times police will pressure you for your name, even though you don't have to give it. And they keep up the pressure, and you end up giving a false name. Well, now they got you, because you chose to break the law, much like in R versus LSL, which I'll get into in later. If you just refuse to give any name, if there's no offense that they say you're being arrested or ticketed for, you wouldn't have to give it. Here are some things you'll see in a First Amendment audit that don't necessarily apply in Canada. So one of the main things you'll see in a First Amendment audit is police will be asked for their names and badge numbers, mainly because most police departments in the States have a policy about stating it when asked. So can you do that in Canada? Well, I don't. And if you want to know more about that, check out a video I posted called Do the Police Have to ID? I'll link it in the description if you haven't seen it. Check it out. But basically how it works in Canada will depend on provincial policies. Most provinces have a policy that says a uniformed police member must have either a name or number displayed on their uniform. If they do not have a name or number displayed, then they are required to give you either a name or number, not both, when asked. If they are displaying a name or number, then they do not have to provide you with anything further. So in Canada, if you see a name or number displayed, then they probably have met their policy obligation, and your asking will be a moot point. Another thing you'll see in a First Amendment audit is often the police will take pictures of the photographer, and the photographer will say something like, don't delete that because I'm going to do a FOIA request on it. So a FOIA is a Freedom of Information Act request. Now in many states, if not all, not quite sure, I don't live there, you can make and receive these requests verbally and anonymously. However, in Canada, you must make this request in writing on a form and provide ID when you submit the form and when you pick up the FOIA request. So good luck trying to remain anonymous and then go hand over your ID. That totally defeats the purpose for me. And I'll never say that unless they already know who I am. I've heard a few people in Canada say it, but still never seen the video or photos requested. So avoid saying it unless you plan on following through with it and posting it. Otherwise, you're going to sound silly. Another thing you'll see in a First Amendment audit is the police will say that what you're doing is suspicious behavior. And the reply is always, is suspicious behavior a misdemeanor or felony? Now, in Canada, we can't say that because we don't have misdemeanors or felonies. So we use different terminology. And I have yet to hear anyone in Canada use proper Canadian terminology. So in the USA, a misdemeanor is a lower level crime. In Canada, we call that a summary offense. And in the USA, a felony is a high level crime. And in Canada, we call that an indictable offense. Also in Canada, we have a third option that is called a hybrid offense. And it can go either way, summary or indictable, depending on the seriousness of the offense. So instead of saying, is suspicious behavior a misdemeanor or felony? In Canada, you would say, is suspicious behavior a summary, hybrid, or indictable offense? Or technically, you can leave out hybrid if you want, as a hybrid offense can only be summary or indictable offenses. Now, here's one I see in the comments section a lot. People say, policy is not law. Well, in Canada, not only is policy law, but even non-policies that don't exist are law. According to provincial trespass acts, the government could just simply put up signs with no code or number associated with it prohibiting acts or behavior. You can also be verbally notified about prohibited acts or behavior. When I was falsely arrested in 2015, I was placed on bail conditions, and I had to go sign in to the bail supervisor every 2 weeks. And because I was documenting this process, I would be video recording when I went to go sign in. And when they noticed that I was recording, they told me I couldn't do it. And I told them, well, I'm allowed, or, show me a law, show me a policy. And they said, oh yeah, well, we have a policy. And I said, that's great. Can I see it? And they said, oh yeah, you can see it. And they couldn't produce it. So what they ended up doing was telling me that if I continued to record, they would revoke my bail. And then I would be arrested and I would be held in prison until I agreed not to record when I went to go sign into bail every 2 weeks. And in April 2016, I made a complaint to the Office of the Ombudsperson. That's the government agency in Canada that handles complaints against the government. And oh my goodness, what a waste of time that was. I finally received a final decision 14 months after my complaint. Wow. Here's the letter I was sent, and I should probably go into more detail about this decision in another video. But basically how it ended was that the government agent that was handling my complaint, Rose Stanton, inquired about my complaint to the Ministry of Public Safety and the Solicitor General and wanted to know what was the policy about recording. The response was that there was no policy. There was only a legal opinion from a lawyer. And Rose Stanton made the decision that that legal opinion from a lawyer superseded any freedom that I had to video record and document my own experience. And my complaint was discontinued and closed. So they were willing to revoke my bail and have me held in prison with no criminal record, not based on a law, not based on a policy, but based on a non-existent policy that was their lawyer's legal opinion. So is policy law in Canada? Oh yeah, you bet it is. Heck, even non-policies that don't exist are law in Canada. As far as recording on private property or public property and sidewalks, you're always going to be, really the only place where you're ever going to be 100% safe is on public sidewalks. Private property, you're never going to be 100% safe. Even on public property, sometimes you're not going to be safe. But a sidewalk, you are always going to be safe to video record or photograph or even protest. Your feelings don't trump my rights. Well, in Canada, we have a criminal code section called criminal harassment, and basically what it says is that you can be charged with a criminal offense if you cause someone to fear for their safety. So that's all based on feelings. You don't actually have to do anything. You just have to cause them to fear for their safety or even feel harassed. And that can be you can be reckless to it as well, which means that you don't even have to be there. You could just, tell someone to do it, and you could be in another part of the world and you could still be charged with that. So you have to be very careful with saying your feelings don't trump my rights, because depending on how you're acting and conducting yourself, their feelings could very well trump your rights. Remember what I was saying before about Section 1 of the Charter? You're learning something now, aren't you? Another thing you'll hear Canadians say on video is they always copy what the Americans say about police swearing an oath to protect us and protect our rights and all this stuff. The police in Canada, the oath that they swear is allegiance to the Queen and her heirs. So be careful when saying things like this in Canada to the police about what their oath is, unless you actually know it. And if you look it up, you'll see that their oath is that they have sworn allegiance to the Queen and her heirs. Not to me, not to you, not to the Charter or Constitution or rights or freedoms or yada, yada, all that stuff. Nope, none of it. My experience with police complaints. I don't make complaints against the police. And what I've found in the past, that if you make complaints against the police, it almost always goes in the favor of the police. The police complaint agencies are largely made up of former police officers, some of which who have families in police departments, which they may take complaints for. But one of the main reasons why I don't make complaints now is in case I have to file a lawsuit. I found out that if you make a complaint against the police, you're going to lose that complaint, and it's not going to work out in your favor, and it's going to look very favorable for the police. So when you go to sue them, if you should sue them, that is something that their lawyer is going to bring up and show to the judge and wave it all around and say, look, Your Honor, the police complaints process did a thorough investigation and found that this complaint had no merit to it and was completely frivolous. And that is never going to work in your favor. But if you didn't make a complaint and the lawyer can't wave around that piece of paper to the judge, then that cannot hurt you and could likely work in your favor. And of course, you always hear people say, oh, this guy's just wasting time. Get a job. You live in mom's basement. Well, I'm certainly not wasting time. I do have a job. I don't live in mom's basement. I don't make these videos because I want to. I make them because I have to. And when you experience what I've experienced as far as government accountability, false narratives, fabricated lies made up by a Victoria Police-based lawyer named Paul Jeffrey Cheeseman about me filming Victoria Police Department officers coming and going, false narratives about me being flagged for violence and about me being a very anti-police person. Okay, no one can say I don't have a reason for doing this, or I'm just wasting time, or I don't have a job. I've tried many times to go about this the right way, make a complaint, wait for the results. Never happens. So no one can say I don't have a reason for doing this, or I'm just wasting time and I don't have a job. Sorry. So some of the criminal offenses in Canada that the police may throw at you for public photography, one of them is mischief. And something you should know about the criminal offense of mischief is that mischief there's what's called a lawful excuse. Means that what you were doing, you were allowed to do it, but they arrested you and charged you anyway. And it's a solid defense. It's a defense that works if you're ever charged with mischief. And that's only if you were what you were doing was you were communicating information. And I'll talk about that more a little bit later when I go into Canadian case law later in the video. But if you are communicating information, the charge of mischief does not apply. So one thing I always try to do in my videos is communicate information. Causing a disturbance. Well, that's a good one because the police often approach you and say, well, you're causing a disturbance. And according to the Justice Institute of British Columbia, the criminal offense of causing a disturbance never applies when it is the result of the police showing up or the police approaching you and speaking with you. So if the police approach you and speak to you and they want to know what you're doing and you don't want to provide ID and they say, well, you're causing a disturbance, never, ever does it apply to the police. Can't be the complainants of causing a disturbance. You have to disturb the public or someone in their home somewhere. Public mischief. Now, I've heard this one a few times. Donald Smith often posts short clips of him going into police stations and asking what's the policy on recording in a public lobby or something like that. And sometimes the police will come out and say, hey, if you don't leave, we'll charge you with public mischief. And it's funny how many times I've actually heard them say this, because public mischief doesn't even apply. Public mischief is section 140 of the criminal code. And if you look it up, you'll see that public mischief applies to when somebody calls the police and reports a crime that never happened, or someone calls the police to sway the attention away from them and onto someone else. So if you ever hear public mischief, just know that they're just pulling that out of a hat. It just sounds good. They're expecting you not to know what it actually means. So another thing I want to talk about here is something I came up with that is a failsafe. And another thing I decided I would do in this sort of Canadian audit thing, if I'm going to a police station to record video or take pictures, is give them notice. The main purpose for this is it acts as a failsafe should I get arrested or charged. Now, I know I'll catch a lot of flack for this because some people believe it defeats the purpose, and I suppose in some situations it can. However, in Canada, you need to be careful when doing this because you want to avoid a citizen calling the police on you, a complainant as they're called. If the police are responding to a call from a complainant, they are acting in good faith, and their qualified immunity will almost always remain intact. So, if you provide them with a notice, then they know about you before anyone can call. If the police react to the notice and there's no complainant, and you get arrested, then the police are acting on their own will and whims, and qualified immunity is not going to be on solid ground. So let's say I give the police a notice saying something like, I'm going to be around taking pictures and video of their building, property, signs, cars, and staff, and everything they would need to know is on the notice. The only thing missing is my personal information, which of course they're not privileged to. Would they even read it? Would they come out and demand ID even though I gave them notice? Would they accuse me of doing things that I said in the notice that I was going to do, but they say it wasn't on the notice? Would the notice confuse them? Would they understand it? The notice also provides a way for you to not answer any questions. Police will often repeat the same question over and over again, hoping that you will give some sort of contradicting information, and they'll use that as some sort of grounds to suspect you of an offense or flat out arrest you. The notice, in fact, answers all the questions, with the exception of my personal information. So let's run this scenario. I give notice. It has everything they need to know about what I'm doing and why. So if they ask me what I'm doing and why, I might just simply respond, well, it's all in the notice, or I gave you guys notice. Now think about it. If I get arrested and criminally charged and I go before a judge and part of my defense is that I gave them notice, any reasonable judge is going to take this into account, and the likelihood of me going to trial or even getting a conviction for something after giving the police notice is, in my opinion, extremely unlikely. This is where one of the biggest differences in the First Amendment Audit and the Canadian versions differ. In America, they have an established right to film and photograph police in public. In Canada, it's not a right, it's a fundamental freedom. So the best way to protect yourself in Canada while exercising this fundamental freedom is to act reasonably. That's really all you have to do. And I know a lot of people are going to chime in and say, oh, freedom of speech is freedom of speech. And yeah, okay. So first of all, in Canada, it's called freedom of expression. And our freedom of expression is not absolute. If you're just being an annoying, disruptive nuisance, then you might not be acting reasonably. And you might end up being criminally prosecuted. There's also a civil cause of action for people who are a nuisance out in public. So if your goal is to be a nuisance out in public, just know that you can be civilly sued for that type of behavior. Now keep in mind that giving this notice is not required, nor is giving out your personal information on the notice. So I came up with a notice that gives the police all the information that they would want to know about what I'm doing, nothing more. And my notice reads like this. Notice. Please be advised, local independent media of communication is in your area today to take pictures and video to be published for news purposes and to communicate matters of public interest. You will likely notice someone in a high-vis vest taking pictures and video of this property, buildings, vehicles, signs, staff, etc. Please do not be alarmed. This should all take between 30 to 60 minutes depending on the activity in the area. The photography will be done from the public sidewalks as much as possible, and no unauthorized entry into restricted areas will be attempted. All signage regarding restricted areas have been acknowledged prior to this visit. Thank you. Now, not everywhere I go will get this notice. Only police stations or places open to the public. I won't go onto a property that have signs saying like you're subject to search like at a prison. So you can be arrested and prosecuted for a crime you didn't commit, but if the judge feels you acted reasonably, then you may not be convicted. So number one thing to remember when doing this in Canada is you have to act reasonably. Two of the best examples of First Amendment auditors that act reasonably are the Batosai, Philip Turner, and Honor Your Oath, Jeff Gray. If you want to see a reasonable person in action, watch those two guys' videos. They nail it every time. If you get arrested and prosecuted, and your defense is that you're a journalist gathering content for a story while yelling at people things like, go kick rocks, you're dismissed, you're going to be a YouTube star, walk of shame. If you present this in court, do you honestly think a judge is going to believe that A, you're a journalist, and B, you acted reasonably? If your answer is yes, or maybe, I would strongly suggest you go watch court trials and bail hearings once a week for a year before attempting this. If you watch a lot of High Desert Community Watch and that's what you want to do, that's why you want to get into this in Canada, you may find out that that type of behavior is not a right in Canada like it is in the USA. Judges here are very sensitive about whether or not you are acting reasonably, so be aware of this. If you don't believe me, like I said earlier, go watch court trials and bail hearings once a week for a year, or even better, study case law and decisions on things like mischief, assault, obstructing police, etc. Now, I want to talk about using the word audits. I really believe Canadians should steer clear of using the word audit because of the deep association with the First Amendment audit, which is an American thing. Why not choose a equally descriptive and appropriate word, which we can call our own? Let's face it, when we converse about a Canadian doing this, we call it an audit. Just using the one word, audit. Like, I'm doing an audit at the Toronto Police. What the heck is an audit? Let's not only drop that word entirely, but let's use the term First Amendment audit as a framework for a better, suitable Canadian term. Okay, so here's what I came up with, and this is what I'm going to use. Take it or leave it. We rely on Section 2 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And Section 2 of the Charter is fundamental freedoms. And when you say that, it makes it clear to someone that doesn't know what you're doing, or may not know what Section 2 of the Charter is, or even worse, confuse it with the American Second Amendment. So because of that, I decided to leave out any reference to Section 2. So it doesn't get misconstrued as something to do with the Americans' Second Amendment. So I want to use fundamental freedoms instead of First Amendment. And that sounds like the most accurate to me. So what can we use in place of the word audit? After trying many descriptive words with the same meaning as audit, I eventually decided on the word evaluation. And so I feel that fundamental freedoms evaluation is what we in Canada should be calling this. This totally sets us apart from the Americans' First Amendment Audit. But it is essentially the same thing, only Canadian specific. And if you look up the word evaluation, you'll likely see that word totally fits with the word audit, so to speak. Now, I want to touch base on catchphrases. A lot of First Amendment auditors have their own catchphrases, and people often copy those. Like, for example, Tom Zebra is known for saying, "You're mistaken, Bacon," and High Desert Community Watch is known for saying, "You're dismissed, go kick rocks," and News Now Houston is known for saying, "I came in by parachute." So now everyone is starting to use those catchphrases, but I would strongly suggest you come up with your own catchphrases. If everyone has the same catchphrases, it becomes very predictable and boring to watch. A little bit of humor where warranted is great, but less is more. If you're acting obtuse and you get arrested and charged, then you're stuck with a video of you doing just that in criminal court before a judge, good luck with that in Canada. Now, this isn't for everyone, and I want you to consider the consequences for your actions before you do this. I firmly believe that if you do not have a stable lifestyle, you probably shouldn't do this. Police encounters that go wrong can really affect your life, and you may lose what little you have and be left with no home, no job, no life. So ask yourself, is your life a game? What's more important in your life right now? If you just want to piss off the police and bark orders at them, you may be doing this for all the wrong reasons. If you get arrested, property seized, and you're being prosecuted, will it affect your mental health? So how is your mental health right now? Ask yourself that before doing this. If you cannot represent yourself in criminal court or cannot afford to hire a lawyer, I'm talking like minimum 30 grand, you probably shouldn't be doing this. Depending on how you go about conducting yourself, you could be arrested and criminally charged. Do you have a plan for that? Have you thought about that? Think about it before doing this. If it happens to you, what will it cost you? Think about it before doing this. And then same question if you have a civil remedy. What do you know about false arrests, and can you argue it in court? What's your plan going to be for that? Think about it before doing this. Property seizures. If you use a cell phone to do this, your cell phone could be seized and detained for court, which means you'll be without that cell phone for well over a year. Do you have a plan for that? How is going without a cell phone for a year going to affect your life? Speaking of seizures, never take anything with you that you cannot have seized, like a dog or young children. Bail or probation. If you're on bail or probation, it's probably because you've bruised a sensitive ego or two somewhere in time. I've been there. So anyways, absolutely, under no circumstances should you be doing this while you're on bail or probation. Most bail probation conditions say you have to keep the peace or be of good behavior, so police can use this as an easy way to have you held in custody for contempt of cop. Again, if you're on bail or probation, absolutely, under no circumstances should you be doing this. If you are going to do this, you need to plan it. Don't just do it on a whim because you see the police have someone pulled over. Especially don't do this while you're working. If you're at your job, say you drive for a company and you pull over to film a traffic stop, you could get arrested. What's going to happen to the company vehicle? What's going to happen with your job? So never just do this on a whim just because you see the police pull someone over. You should always plan when you're going to do this, when you have time to do it. Now, I've heard some people say that they're going to travel and do this. So like, I know I keep bringing him up, Donald Smith. He's a good example. He keeps saying, I'm going to go to Nova Scotia and do this. I'm going to do this in Vancouver Island, and I'm going to do this in Alberta. And I want you to consider what the consequences might be if you get arrested or charged for doing this and you're nowhere near where you live. You may have to come back there for court appearances. So for example, if you live on Vancouver Island and you want to do this in Alberta, or you want to do this in Nova Scotia or Ontario, you get arrested and charged, you may have to go. You may have to find your way out there, a couple of times over the next year or two, just to make court appearances. So traveling can be a bad idea. So I want you to consider that before doing it. Another thing you should consider is going hands-free with your cameras. We see this all the time where cell phones get slapped out of people's hands, or people claim, oh, they put a camera in my face, and it's, 20 feet away. So if you're hands-free, no one can say that you put a camera in their face. And if you're hands-free, no one can slap anything out of your hand. We've seen it many times where people get things slapped out of their hands, and the police are like, oh well, too bad. So consider going hands-free. Call floods. Now, you see this a lot in the States with First Amendment audits, and in Canada, I would advise against it because remember I was talking earlier about the charge of mischief? So mischief relates to obstructing the use of property. And if you cause a call flood to happen somewhere where they cannot, there's so many phone calls coming in that no one can get through, and you caused that to happen, you could be criminally charged with mischief because you obstructed the lawful use of that property. You caused that to happen. And in Canada, that's a criminal offense. So I would strongly advise in Canada that you never mention a call flood and you discourage anyone from doing a call flood. I would suggest that maybe something alternative like an email might be the better way to go. And briefly, I want to talk about the right to resist arrest. And I see lots of comments about this all the time. People say, "Oh, you should have resisted, or you could have shot him if you had a gun, or whatever." Well, that's never going to work in your favor. And in Canada, yes, you do have the right to resist an unlawful arrest, but your arrest will never be deemed unlawful until a judge says it's unlawful, and that could take years. So when you're out on the street with the police and they want to arrest you and you're like, well, I got the right to resist, they're not going to be like, oh, right, you do. Okay, go ahead and you swing and I'll swing and we'll take turns. It's never going to work out like that. They're absolutely going to beat you down with everything they have. They're going to do it as hard as they can and as quick as they can. And they're going to get those cuffs on and you're going to be charged with obstructing police and resisting arrest and all this stuff. So, yes, you do have the right to resist. But consider the consequences for those actions. And remember what I said earlier, is your life a game? Can you afford to have a broken arm or a broken leg or a broken orbital socket? I would always tell people, never resist, never. Just take the arrest and you can live to fight another day. Now I want to go through some Canadian case law, and we'll start with one called Moore versus the Queen, 1978. And this deals with when you have to ID in Canada to the police. And Mr. Moore, who was riding his bicycle, was observed committing some sort of traffic infraction. And the Victoria police officer that wanted to issue Mr. Moore a ticket had to end up charging Mr. Moore with obstructing police because Mr. Moore refused to provide his identification for the ticket. So as I said earlier, if the police observe you committing some sort of offense, you will have to provide your identification. And if you refuse, you could not only be charged, but also convicted of obstructing police. R versus Honorowski, 2003. And this is another when to ID in Canada. And I'm just going to give you a quote here from the judge's decision. The judge says that if Constable Warren had seen the accused commit an offense, that would have provided the legal substratum for the request made of the accused to provide his name. Without the legal substratum, the constable was not engaged in the execution of her duties when she requested that the accused disclose his identity. So you can rely on R versus Honorowski for when you are not obligated to identify to the police in Canada. R versus LSL. Just going by the initials of LSL, I can tell already that this was somebody who was a minor, not an adult. And this deals with what happens when you give the police a false name, even though you were never obligated to give any name. And LSL was convicted for giving a false name, even though LSL was never legally obligated to require any name. So this proves the point that you should always remain silent over providing your identification or name when you're not required to. R versus Guthrie, 1982. This is one of my favorites. This is a suspicious person at a police station, whether or not they have to ID. So Miss Guthrie was alleged to have been found in suspicious circumstances at night near a secure area of a police station, and the police were alarmed about that and wanted her identification, and she refused to provide it because she hadn't committed an offense, but she was suspicious according to the police. And this case law made out that she was not obligated to provide any information to the police because she had not been found committing an offense, even though she was found in suspicious circumstances. Here's some great case law I found on mischief. And you remember earlier how he's talking about acting reasonably? And this is perfect because there's two cases here I want to point out that both deal with the offense of mischief, and that was obstructing the use of or enjoyment of property. And what these two cases have to do specifically with is photography at nude beaches. And in the first case, R versus Lebanfish, this man was out. He intentionally went to a nudist beach, and he was nude himself, and he was just taking random pictures here and there. Other people were also noted to be taking pictures of the scenery, nothing nefarious. And someone told a young lady that Mr. Lebanfish had taken a picture of her from behind. And she was upset about that. And he offered to delete it off his camera, and he did. And she was okay with it, but then she felt not so good about it after. She called the police. The police arrested Mr. Lebanfish for mischief. And it was found, the judge's decision ruled that Mr. Lebanfish was acting reasonably, and he wasn't hiding what he was doing. There was no what's called willful intent or evil intent, and he had just a right to photograph in the area just of the scenery as anyone else that was doing the same thing that he was doing, including the complainant that called the police on him. She was also taking photographs of the scenery. So because Mr. Lebanfish was acting reasonably, he could not be convicted. However, in the next case is R versus Taylor, where in similar circumstances, Mr. Taylor showed up to a nude beach, and he had I believe it was a camcorder sort of stashed in a towel, and he was video recording surreptitiously. And he would be zooming in on women's behinds and recording that, and people caught him doing this, and then they called the police on him, and Mr. Taylor was convicted for mischief because he was obstructing people's enjoyment of that property, even though it was public property. So the judge ruled that Mr. Taylor was acting unreasonably, and he had willful intent. He was some sort of evil intent. He caused other people to lose their enjoyment of that area, that property that was public property. And this again goes with what I was saying earlier about do your feelings trump my rights? And Mr. Taylor here was convicted for his willful intent, his evil intent, and his actions which caused people to feel the loss of enjoyment for that property, even though it was public property. Another good Canadian case law for mischief. This one deals with what I was talking about earlier about communicating information, and it's R versus Tan. And in this case, these protesters wanted to communicate information about a U.S. warship that was anchored off in Canadian waters. So this group of protesters decided that they would get in their small boat and get out to where this warship was, climb up the anchor chain, and lock themselves onto it with a sign that was communicating information. And they believed that they were protected by doing this. But of course, the judge ruled that this was not a reasonable way to go about it, and this certainly obstructed the lawful use of the property, which was the worship. And the judge ruled in R versus Tan that this protester was guilty of mischief. Another good one is R versus Breeden, 2007. This is a good one about going inside of buildings, even government buildings. So Mr. Breeden was displaying signs. He was basically a protester, and he wanted to display his signs inside the buildings that he was protesting about. And he was directed to leave. He was told he could, go out and do this on the sidewalk as much as possible. He refused to do so. And this did not work out in Mr. Breeden's favor. And this is great case law for that protects you for your activities when you remain on the public sidewalks. Another good one is R versus Robert John McFadden in 2016. And this has to do with photographing the police in the street and approaching them and being too close and being charged with obstruction. I'll let you go ahead and read through that. It's very interesting. Here's one that was actually a lawsuit in Supreme Court in British Columbia. It's called Walkie versus Canada, 1997. And this has to do with false arrest and false imprisonment. I'll let you read through that. Here's one called R versus Davidson. This is another criminal matter from 2011, where the judge ruled that Mr. Davidson was basically beat up by the police because they didn't like what he had to say. He had some nasty things to say to the police, and they basically beat him up. And to quote Justice Leslie Baldwin, she said that she finds that the reasons for Mr. Davidson's arrest was what she called, quote, contempt of cop, unquote. Great Canadian case law there. Check it out. And the next one is another criminal matter called R versus Zarafinitis, 2013. And at the time, Mr. Zarafinitis was a police officer acting in his official capacity. And Mr. Zarafinitis was criminally charged after he beat up a photographer. So this is great case law. You'll definitely find what the judge says pretty interesting about police officers and photographers when you read this. Ward versus the City of Vancouver. This is some great case law on how long things can play out in courts. Mr. Ward was alleged to have been reported. Remember I said earlier about how it can be dangerous to have a complainant? Don't ever let anyone call the police on you for something like this. So Mr. Ward was observing a public appearance of the Prime Minister of Canada at the time, and someone called in about somebody who was going to attempt to hit the Prime Minister with a pie. And Mr. Ward fit the description of that person. Mr. Ward was pursued by police. He was arrested. He was strip searched, had his car impounded, and Mr. Ward wanted to sue the police and the city of Vancouver. And this went on this first went to Supreme Court in 2007, went to back to the Court of Appeal in 2009, and then finally to the Supreme Court of Canada in 2010. And I'll let you go through it all and read it all. And this is what it's like if you want to fight for your rights, folks. And finally, we have it's another lawsuit called Bracken versus Fort Erie. And this is another one of those cases that, went through the courts a few times. This guy eventually had to go through the Ontario Court of Appeal, which he finally won. And the case law for this really deals with, remember earlier I said about how you got to know Section 1 of the Charter, because Section 1 deals with the reasonableness. And this is great case law about Section 1 of the Charter and the reasonableness of, the protester or the person doing public photography, the false narratives that government agents can make about people and other kind of related stuff like that. So this is really good case law. The final court appearance on this matter was in 2017 in the Ontario Court of Appeal. Now, obviously, there's way more case law that you can look up. This isn't, the only one that kind of pertains to what you could be potentially dealing with if you decide to do this. So one of the things that I came up with for my Fundamental Freedom Evaluation series was that I wanted to sort of, if any fails occur, I want to sort of classify them, because I noticed that In First Amendment audits, there's fails that happen all the time, but it could be somebody putting their hand on your shoulder or somebody kicking you to the ground and confiscating all your cameras and having you criminally prosecuted. So to me, there's a big difference between the two. And I think, if it's not too late, maybe we should be doing this. Every time you see a First Amendment audit or something similar in Canada, like what I call a fundamental freedom evaluation, and again, this is what I'm going to do with my videos, is I'm going to have different levels or classes of fails. So like there might be a class 1 fail, a class 2 fail, or a class 3 fail. I believe that a pass is a pass. A pass will always be a pass. But my personal belief is that a fail is sometimes very minor and sometimes very egregious. And I think we need to come up with a system. Well, I've come up with a system that I'm going to use. It'd be neat to see people use this, but fails, that's pretty broad, to say that, well, that cop put his hand on my shoulder, or, the cop beat the crap out of me and took all my camera gear. There's a big difference between the two. So I came up with this system. Now, as I said earlier, passes are pass. There's no classes for those. But a fail, this is what I came up with. A class 1 fail is the butthurt class. So section 1 of class 1, the butthurt class, is repeatedly asking or pressuring for personal information or ID. So to me, that would be a fail. Not a big fail, not a horrendous fail, but a butthurt class 1 fail. And section 2, I came up with if you're accused of suspicious behavior or you're compared to a terrorist or terrorist activity. Section 3 would be accusing you of doing something that you're not doing. Section 4 would be threats of being followed but not being followed. Section 5 would be being asked to stop recording in a public setting. Section 6 would be being asked to leave a public area. And Section 7 would be a cam-back. Now, the Class 2 fail would be the tyrant class. And Section 1 says that you are being told that you're being detained. And Section 1, this section applies whether or not there is any loss of liberty or movement. Section 2, physical intimidation or entering into another person's personal space. Section 3, Class 2 camera interferences include the following, but not limited to. Subsection A, being told you're not allowed to record in a public setting. Subsection B, being told to shut off cameras in a public setting. Section 4, being told to leave a public area or being forced to leave a public area because of physical intimidation and or verbal threats of arrest, whether they are real or implied. Section 5, initiating rude or disrespectful behavior or comments, including, but not limited to, condescending or dismissive comments about A, public photography, B, rights preservation, C, choosing not to provide personal information, D, anything related to a person having nothing better to do or needing a job. Section 6, repeatedly calling out any private person's full name or any personal information in a public setting with the intent that it gets publicly disclosed. Section 7, disclosing or discussing any person's potential criminal history in a public setting with the intent that it gets publicly disclosed, regardless if it is A, legitimate, B, alleged only, C, fictitious or a rumor, and D, fabricated. Class 3 is the criminal class. This would be the worst of the worst fails. Section 1, intentionally shining a light in anyone's eyes. Section 2, Class 3 camera interferences, including the following but not limited to A, cameras moved, B, cameras damaged, C, cameras seized, D, cameras turned off, E, cameras manipulated with any light shining devices or manipulated in any other manner to obstruct, interrupt, or interfere with or to prevent recording of audio or video in any manner. Section 3, any video or audio footage altered or deleted in any manner. Section 4, attempting to assert any policy, bylaw, or law that does not exist or does not apply to the situation. Section 5, being followed. Section 6, being handcuffed. Section 7, being assaulted, as defined by the Criminal Code of Canada. Section 8, being arrested, which means you're being forced to ID. Section 9, being charged or prosecuted. Section 10, any acts contrary to the Criminal Code of Canada or Canadian case law. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed this informative video. This is not legal advice. I am not a lawyer. I hope that I've provided you with enough information for you to decide not to do this. And if you do decide to do this, you'll be doing this informed. Thanks for watching.